It is now 8 o'clock, so I will start this session. Welcome everybody to an evening with Nick Dunhill, who will be showing us how to do some scratch building. We will invite questions from the audience tonight. Those questions should be posed because there's a lot of us and we can't really do it by using our voice. So if you would use the chat facility, please. The chat facility you will find at the bottom of your screen, and you will be able to type your questions in. The questions will then be fielded by Tony Kell, who will be monitoring that. Yes, he's just waving at you. Tony will then interject into Nick's talk at suitable places to ask those questions. We'll try and keep it sort of fairly flexible as the evening goes on. So if you see something you'd like to ask a question about, please do. That's the whole point of these sessions. It's not just for us to hear our own voices. Okay. The session is being recorded, so if you do not want your face to appear in the recording, then I suggest you turn your video off. Once again, you can see that at the bottom of your screen, and you just press the stop video button. Okay, I will be keeping everybody muted during this evening. So if you unmute by accident, you will find that I will mute you again. Don't worry about this. It doesn't stop you unmuting. You can do that at any time if you really want to. But I would suggest that we try and keep things reasonably quiet. Okay, have I missed anything, Tony?
Just if you ask questions, use the chat box, which is located at the bottom of the screen. It comes up like a little text thing on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Type in that to everyone if you would, then everybody can see your questions. I'll then relay those questions to Nick during the course of the evening. I'll try to get every one of them done as quickly as possible. Nick said he doesn't mind being interrupted, but we've got quite a lot to get through. So if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to ask them, but I may not be able to ask them immediately. Thank you very much.
Okay, Nick, do you want to begin?
Over to me. Well, thanks ever so much, everyone, for coming along to watch me solder together bits of nickel silver on such a glorious evening as well. I'm going to attempt to scratch build a smokebox for a locomotive. A few weeks ago, I put out a thread on the Gauge Guild's forum and just asked if anybody wanted a smokebox making. And a chap called Simon got in touch and emailed me this, which you can't see, but don't worry, it'll be on a slide very shortly. He sent me a drawing and the prototype's a Hull and Barnsley loco from the 1880s that was made by B.A. Peacocks. So you'll see in a minute when we start the PowerPoint presentation that it's got quite an interesting shape to it. It's kind of wasted in at the middle and then fits snugly between the portion of the locomotive frames that stick up between the chassis. So perhaps if James could put me the first piece of the PowerPoint presentation up.
Indeed.
We can start there.
There you go.
There we go, scratch building a smokebox. Now, I really didn't think it was appropriate for you to watch me cutting out little rectangles of brass for several hours. So I did do a bit of prep in advance. Here's one I made earlier, as they say, on a well-known TV program. But if you go to the next one, the PowerPoint presentation really is just aims to set out how I cut out all the parts, and then we'll come round after the PowerPoint presentation to soldering them all together, and we'll do that live. So, you know, we'll see how we get on with that. Right, well, the first slide there shows the drawing that Simon sent to me by email. One of the first things that I always check when I get a drawing through email is just to check the scale on it. I mean, Simon sent this claiming that it was a 1:1 7mm scale drawing. So I found a measurement on it and just checked it, just made sure it was actually the height of something was 4 feet, which was nice and conveniently 28mm. But when I looked at it on the drawing, it was only 26mm. So obviously the process of creating a PDF and emailing it to me and then printing it out reduced the scale of the drawing somewhat. So I think that was probably worth knowing. So if you go to the next slide, please, James, you can see what I've done there is done some measurements and worked out that I need to multiply by a conversion factor of 1.05. So everything I measure off the drawing, you multiply by 1.05, and that gives you the dead size of it in 7mm scale. And you can see on the smokebox front there that I've made some very basic measurements. I always start by just making a kind of a vertical line perpendicular to the footplate going up through the center of the smokebox. And then you can take datum points all the way down that line, which will allow you then to sort of draw it out. But obviously the most important thing is to start with the dead center, and that's usually where the smokebox dart goes in. And in this case, there's a nice smokebox dart smack in the middle, so that's where we started. You can see that I've sort of taken some horizontal measurements across the drawing at various places above the center line, and that's just really to help me get the kind of radius wasted in bit at the bottom. If you can see, it kind of curves in and then curves back out in quite a kind of a pleasing way. So if you want to zoom on to the next one, I kind of transpose that into a very basic sort of sketch. But you have to bear in mind when you're taking these measurements that you have to subtract twice the thickness of the material that you're using in some places. And right at the bottom of the firebox, the smokebox, it's always a good idea to make sure that it will fit between the frames on the engine. Now, there's always some compromises involved in fine scale modelling. The back-to-backs are such that back-to-backs of the wheels are such that you can never get the locomotive chassis to a true scale. It always ends up being 2 or 3 millimeters narrower than it should be. And what I always like to do actually is transfer that to the bit of the footplate that sticks up above the chassis, up above the footplate, so that it's kind of coincident all the way up the chassis, and you don't get a step at the footplate level. Now that sometimes means that I kind of narrow in the bottom of the smokebox, so it will nestle between the frames. But in this case, I got in touch with Simon, and Simon decided that he wanted it to scale above the footplate, and he was going to sort out the chassis himself. So that was fine. So that made it a bit easier for me, because I just took the dead measurements off the drawing.
Nick,
yeah, go on.
Yeah, Nigel Payne's mentioned that when it comes to the photocopy that you've got, or the drawing that you've got, if it's under scale, then you can use your photocopier and enlarge it. Use the enlarge or reduce.
Yeah, you can. I'm not entirely sure that I trust the photocopy part of me printer either. So I think it's probably worth taking a measurement. But he's right. I have done that in the past, where you just kind of reduce it a little bit. So he's absolutely right. See what I'm doing here in this picture? What I've got are lots and lots and lots of tatty bits of brass and nickel silver sheet, none of which have a right angle or a flat edge on them. And that's always the first place to start, isn't it? Is just to file a flat edge so that you can get a square on it and start drawing things out in a sensible way. If you want to move on to the next one. And there it is, I'm checking it. And what I'm using there is I've got a series of just kind of machined blocks. They're things actually that I think Nigel Smith, or it might have been Fred Lewis, gave me at a show. He said, hey, do you want these? And I said, yeah, they'd be really useful. And they're just rectangles of aluminium that are just machined dead square, you know, so that you can wrap things around them in the knowledge that they're at a right angle. And we'll come to that in a bit, because there's a lot of that in this demonstration, taping things to things that are square. Do you want to just check? One of the keys to this really is just to be as accurate as you possibly can, especially with something like a smoke box. You want to make sure that absolutely everything's square. And also you want to make sure that the front and the rear former are absolutely, identical to each other as well. I don't think they have to be particularly symmetrical to the nearest hundredth of a millimetre, but they certainly need to be identical to each other. And that's the key really to all of this cutting out, is just to use a square and make sure that everything's dead square. And I always measure everything using my trusty vernier down to a tenth of a millimetre as well, you know, making sure that all the pieces are all the same size. Let's hope that I did it, eh? Let's hope I was successful with these parts that I've cut out. Do you want to move on to the next one then, please, James? I don't know whether you can actually see from that photograph, but you can see I've sort of scribed out the shape of the front of the smoke box. I just transferred the measurements from the basic sketch that you saw a couple of slides ago, and I use a scriber, and I've got something called a compass cutter that I think you can just see in the bottom corner. It's actually designed, I think, for cutting out bits of vinyl, but it kind of works quite well as a compass and scribes quite nicely a circle onto the brass.
One here, Nick. Is that thing you use?
That's the one, except mine's quite a lot smaller than that. Or maybe it's a little bit further away from the screen. Also, the little wasted in bits at the bottom that you can see, I actually drew those with a circle stencil that I've had since I was at school. You know, I must have been a teenager. I think it comes in those sets with a square and a protractor, and it's got lots of holes, and I was dead lucky. Mine went up in millimetre diameter holes, and I looked out, and one of them was, you know, pretty close to the wasty in bits at the bottom of the smoke box that you can see there. And if you zip to the next one, please, James. And that's me cutting it out. That's my saw, and that's my compass cutter there. You can see it's held together with bits of tape. And I just use a piercing saw. I must mention, I suppose, at this point, that everything that I'm going to solder together tonight, being cut out of 10 thou, which is about 0.3 nickel silver. And I know 0.3 might sound a bit thin, but it's got a couple of advantages. Firstly, you can manipulate it by hand. You don't need to use pinch rollers or anything like that to form it. As you'll see later, I can bend it around the shank of a drill or around variously sized rods and so on, you know, and it's very, very easy to manipulate. And then when you've actually started soldering it all together, you get quite a solid structure. So,
Nick, you mentioned you use a piercing saw. What
I do.
blades do you use?
Oh, I always use, I think, 006. They're the finest ones that I can buy. All the usual people that turn up at O-Gauge shows sell them. I think it's quite important, well, it is very important when you're cutting anything from 10 thou sheet, that you use a blade that has a pitch that's less than the thickness of the material, otherwise the saw just won't cut it. It'll be, you know, you'll find yourself snapping lots of blades and distorting the sheet. So although it's you know, it's a very, very, very fine blade, and you do get through quite a lot of them, it is a 006 blade, and it's just a very simple. As you can see there, I have it in my hand. If you can, you probably can't see me in the little box. It's a piercing saw blade that I've had for donkey's years. I used to have a girlfriend who was a silversmith, and I liberated some of her tools when we went our separate ways. And so I've had that piercing saw now for, God, it must be 30 years or something.
When you say 006, do you know how many teeth per inch that is?
You know what? I've absolutely no idea how many TPI that is. Hopefully someone's got an engineer's Bible to hand and can check that for me. I think it's the finest that Eileen's Emporium sell, and Tracy Tools, but of course other tool suppliers are available. I think they go down a bit further than that, and that you can get them that are even finer. But I honestly couldn't tell you how many teeth per, is it millimetre or centimetre that we use? Or are we still on inches for saw pitch? So I'm sorry, I can't really tell you that.
I believe it might be 81 teeth per inch.
Oh, there we go. Thank you for that, James.
That's right.
Somebody's mentioned the, on that picture in the middle of it is like a disc stander.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is it fixed on a rubber mount?
Well, it's what it is well, you'll see me using it later. It's a rubber arbor that fits in the chuck of a mini drill, and you just stick sanding discs that I make to it. And as you'll see later, they're pretty good for razzing through you know, material of this thickness and tidying it all up, and it saves you a lot of effort with a file. And also they're really good for taking the etching cusps as well off you know, pre-etched kits. But I'll show you that later, and I'll explain how I make them as well.
Thank you.
That's no problem. Do you want to move on to the next one then, please? And this kind of demonstrates the point I was trying to emphasize earlier. You know, I've kind of cut one of the formers out, and to get the second one, basically, as you can see, what I've done is soldered it to you know, the next available space on the sheet. And essentially what I've done there is just cut round it and you know, sort of filed it. Now that doesn't guarantee that the two sides of that former are symmetrical, but what it does guarantee is that they're a perfect match for each other. And then when I separate them, I'll grind all the solder off the inside, and I'll mark them very carefully that they're you know, the two faces that are to go on the inside, so that when you solder them to the base and you solder some transoms between them, that they're still symmetrical. Anyway, we'll come to that later. We'll have a bit of fun soldering everything together. If you want to move on to the next one. And there I am, look, actually, with my little sanding attachment in my drill, just sort of tidying up the one that I cut so it matches the one that was soldered onto the top of it. And of course that guarantees that you get two formers that absolutely match each other. I mean, it seems the obvious way of doing it to me, really. I made some notes. What else did I say? And do you want to sort of move on to the next one? There they go, look. And I think if you look carefully, you can see I've scribed in on the faces that are to be inside the structure. And just to be doubly sure, I didn't bother cleaning them up that much, because then I'll always look for the nicest sides to go on the outside. Do you want to jump to the next one?
Nick, just as a point, do you never solder two pieces of metal together before making your first cut?
No, I don't. I always do one, and then solder that to the sheet and do the second one. I suppose that way you're not knackering double the amount of material, are you, if it all goes horribly wrong? Is it, oh, you can see also what I've done in that slide. You can see I've cut out a base, and the two little thin strips above it, as you'll see a little bit later, are just to sort of form sort of stretchers between the top part, sort of transom beams, if you like, between the top part of the formers, just to make sure that they're parallel to each other before we start forming the wrapper. Do you want to jump to the next one? Thank you. Now, this is the method I use for finding the length of the wrapper that I need. I think what I've done there is either stretched a piece of paper or possibly some masking tape around the perimeter of the former, and then probably marked the length that I need to cut out so that I can form it all the way around the perimeter of the former. And obviously you add a little bit on as well. It's nice to have a bit of wiggle room, isn't it? Something to cut off. Again, that's cut out a 10th thou sheet because it's much easier to manipulate by hand. I know a lot of kits these days seem to have boilers and fireboxes and smoke boxes that are etched in 15 thou 0.45, isn't it? Which is commonly what kits are etched in. And I always find, I don't know whether anybody else has this problem, but I always find that it's kind of at the limits of what my pinch rollers can roll, really. They start to distort at that size as well. You know, the edges of the sheet get rolled quite a little bit more than the centre sections. And also, you really can't manipulate it at all by hand. It's just a little bit too thick. So anyway, that's my preferred thickness, is 10th thou. And as I said, it is, you know, once you've soldered up a structure, a boiler, you know, a cylinder or something, it is quite stiff once you've, there we go, 15th thou is 0.38. What's 0.45 then? Is that 18th thou? Is that what all kits come in?
Something like that, yes.
Do you want to jump to the next one? I think that, there you go, that just shows some piercing saw action, doesn't it? It just shows me cutting the former out of a brand new sheet of nickel silver. There we go. And the next one. There we go. There's all the pieces ready to go. So I'm going to switch. If you want to turn the PowerPoint presentation off and put me back on, I will switch to hand cam and head cam, and I'll just switch on me. Are we okay? Is everybody okay there? Can we all see what's happening? And
Yes.
the lamp isn't in shot either, is it?
No.
Then we will begin. Right. So, as I've been stressing all the way through this, I did go to great lengths to make sure that the base was perfectly square and perfectly matched the dimension of the bottom of the former, like so. So the first step we're going to do is to solder the base to the former. And the way I'd always do that is with these sort of little bits of aluminium that I mentioned earlier, and my trusty square, and a bit of masking tape. So, we'll start with some masking tape, and we'll stick some on the base. And then we'll get our square, and we'll just position the base so that I know the end of the base is now square with the edge of that block, and just stick it in place with a bit of masking tape, like so. And because I'm doubly paranoid, I always like to sort of sight it by eye as well, and just check that everything's square. And then we'll take a former. Now we have to be careful to note where it says in there, and that's the inside of the structure. So that sort of has to be soldered onto the base in that way. And for that, we'll get another piece of masking tape, like so. And I'll stick that to the front of our smokebox, and then we'll line them up, and I'll try to do that so you can see what I'm doing. And I think that, considering I'm doing it live in front of dozens of people, isn't too bad. But we'll just, to be doubly sure, pop the square there and just press everything together. Now I think what we've got there is the base and the front of the smoke box at 90 degrees to each other, and overlapping in the right way. The front of the former is at the front of the base, if you see what I mean. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply a bit of flux, like so, and we're going to tack it in the corners with my trusty soldering iron. Now I know what's going to happen here is that I'm going to get a really snotty solder, because the aluminium block's immediately going to suck all the heat out of the soldering iron tip. So we'll tack it there. Wait a minute for the tip of the iron to get back up to temperature, and we'll tack it there. Can we see all this so far?
Yep, see it perfect. We're getting asked, you know, when you're cutting out your straight edge of the wrapper,
Yeah.
is it easier to use a scroker rather than a piercing saw?
Now, that's interesting, that, because a couple of the fellas that also build professionally always tell me to use a scroker, and I'm not entirely sure what one is, if I'm honest with you. I always like to cut everything out using a piercing saw, because that way everything's perfectly flat. Mm-hmm. You know, you're not using a cutting tool that's going to distort the edge of anything that you're cutting out. But I mean, a scroker may do that. I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Basically, a pointed hooked blade.
The what? Sorry.
Well, there's two sorts. One is like a, you know, the carpet blade that you get for cutting carpets. It's a hooked blade.
Okay, yeah. It's like that, is it?
You can use one.
The idea is that you make a deep groove and then fracture the material. Is it like that?
Presume so.
The idea? No, I've never used one. I was just a bit paranoid that it might sort of distort the edge. And maybe it's a good way of doing it. I don't know. Again, this isn't a definitive guide to scratch building. It's just the way I've sort of taught myself to do it.
Nick, this is one.
What sort of flux do you use?
This is a scroker.
Right. Thank you, whoever's showing us that. Flux, I use phosphoric acid, and it's applied, as you can see, with my special tool, which is 2 cocktail sticks stuck together with insulating tape. Anyway, so there we go. We've basically tacked the front to the base, so we can take the tape off. And with a bit of luck, these won't fall apart. Trying to kind of hold it to my, spot it with my hand so we don't end up jolting it. And there we go. Look, we've got 2 things soldered together. And just to check, we'll pop that on my square, just to check that everything's square, and it is. So we're happy with that. So we'll get the sanding attachment, and we'll just whiz off all the excess solder there. Can you kind of see what I'm doing?
Yeah.
Just getting rid of all the solder and I can see that enough solder's come through in the back of the joint to support it, so I'm not going to tack it anymore. Sometimes what happens when you start tacking it again is that you get distortion and the angle will start to close up. So I'm not going to do that. We'll just check that again. You can see that's all nice and square, no problem at all with that. So the next step, of course, is to solder the front or the rear to that. And it's the same process again. More masking tape. And we'll line that up on the piece of block. And it gets quite complicated now because you haven't got quite as much room to manipulate things. Again, we'll do that to line it up. Stick the tape down. Great stuff. And then, this is all going quite well. This demonstration could be over by 9 o'clock at this rate. And again, I'm double checking, you see, that this is the inside and this is the outside. And pop that there. We'll line it up by eye. But we'll also use a square there just to, this is where it all gets hideously difficult to manipulate. Like so. Oops, look at that. The pack's come off. I'll have to do that again. So we've slid down the snake and we're back at stage 1. I must have bashed it. Anywho.
A lot of sod.
A lot of sod. This happens a lot. Anyway, there we go. That's nicely aligned. So, or is it? Yes. Check twice, solder once.
What iron are you using?
It's a Ursa Icon 1. It's a sort of temperature controlled soldering iron. It was a gift to myself a few years ago when I started doing this professionally. I used to pride myself on just using really cheap Maplin soldering irons, which for people outside of the UK is a now defunct electronics store. Sorry?
What wattage is it?
Do you know what? I've no idea. It's kind of variable. It pumps a huge amount of heat into the tip, so it does maintain temperature even when you're soldering, you know, quite chunky bits. And you can, you know, swap over the soldering iron tip as well for a bigger one, and that'll put even more heat into your job. Right, so we'll take that off. We'll just nip the solder off there and we'll go back. And
Pete Hutchinson says the Ursa has a maximum output of 80 watts.
on an Ursa Icon.
Yep.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to break my golden rule and I'm just going to tack that with a big blob there so that we don't snap it off again. And as you can see, it's not square anymore. It's putting that big blob on has distorted it. So we'll hold it there on the square. We'll touch the big blob and that squared it up That's good. Excellent. Right, we'll move on. Do this bit again. Bit of tape on our block. Sorry about that. Somebody's just gone up our street on a noisy motorbike.
Never heard it.
Did you not? Right. Oh, missed that completely.
What solder are you using?
What solder? It's 145 solder.
And what temperature have you got the iron set at?
350. I don't think you can go much higher than that with 145 solder. I'm told that it decomposes it beyond that temperature. Right, let's get this right. There we go. So that's sort of back to the block.
James says that that's a fairly common temperature to use with 145 solder.
Yeah. I have to thank Tony Geary for that. It was Tony that put me on to getting an Ursa icon, and he actually passed over the temperatures that he uses. So he said it was very successful for him. So I just went with it, and it does work for me. If I'm using 90 degrees solder, I always turn the iron down to 200. And that way you don't melt your castings, but the solder runs quite nicely. So you can see what I've done there is I've soldered the other part of the former of the smoke box. I've soldered it, I've taped it in position now around this square piece. So we'll solder that. Blob there, a bit of flux there. Solder you there. Solder you there. Jolly good. Right. With a bit of luck, the joints will hold. And we can take it off the kind of forming block thing. There we are. I claim victory. So that's the basic structure. And then we're going to solder these pieces in there. Now they're just to kind of strengthen the whole thing. Before we solder it up a little bit more to give it a bit more strength. Now I just kind of eyeball these to try and make them square to the pieces that I've put on there. They're exactly the same dimension as the base. So this is the bit where I burn this out. There.
Apparently the advice regarding 350 degrees originally came from Bob Alderman.
Oh really? Oh Bob, where are you now?
Sadly no longer with us.
Yeah, poor old Bob. There we are, let's eyeball that. Now you'll see that, you'll note that I've just formed these cross pieces to one side. There we are. Great. Now I've got a basic box, and what I'm going to do is just check that you can see, look, that they're at right angles to each other. And can you see that on my camera, that the front and the back are dead square to each other, which means that we'll be able to get the wrapper on nice and evenly, which is just as well because I've not left myself very much length or width. This is all going quite well for a live demonstration, isn't it? There we go.
It's going very well.
We'll tack the those pieces back on.
And you've not burnt your fingers yet.
I haven't, not yet. And then we'll just check it again, and it's still nice and square, so we'll not end up with a parallelogram shaped. That's very good, I'm happy with that. And that's square, and that's also square, so we're good to go with the wrapper. But what I'm going to do first is just strengthen these joins so I don't end up snapping anything. You can see that it's just kind of blobby soldering on the inside. Get the iron in and get it out quickly so that the heat doesn't distort anything. Because you can't see any of this anyway. Well, obviously, if I was making a smoke box that had all the internal detail and opening smoke box door and what have you, I'd take a lot more care over this. And also what I might do is put the back and the base together and then build all the internal detail then onto the back and then put the front on. And obviously the front would have a much bigger hole to accommodate the smoke box door. So there we have it. That's our basic building block of the smoke box. And if you just bear with me a minute, I'll just use my sanding disc. As you can see, these are sanding discs that I make myself. I buy 180 grade wet or dry. Now, always go and buy good quality stuff. I'm quite lucky there's a hardware shop up in the shopping area at the top of our street, which is quite handy because hardware shops are a dying thing these days. Anyway, and basically all I do is I draw around a coin that I've got. I think it's a forged pound coin that, and I just kind of draw around them and cut them out. Sorry, I'll start again. I put double-sided tape on the back of the wet and dry paper and draw around this fake pound coin and then cut them out. And then you can peel the backing paper off and stick them onto the rubber arbor there in my mini drill. And they're just fantastic, as you can see, for ripping excess solder, like so.
Frank mentioned,
And a bit there, and a bit there, and a bit there, and then that's the basic smoke box. So now we're on to the wrapper.
Nick, Frank mentions that if you're having to do a lot of holding of things while you're soldering, a couple of layers of micropore around your fingers may help.
Yeah, yeah. So this is the wrapper, and what I've done is it's just fractionally wider than the formers are apart. I hope it's fractionally longer than it needs to be, so we can bend it all the way around and there'll be a bit to cut off. And I was especially careful with one edge. You probably can't see that, but it's marked straight. So this is the edge that's very straight. This I didn't bother so much with because it'll overhang the back or the front of the smoke box anyway. So the idea is that we're going to form this to shape using some metal bars, and then we're going to solder it around this structure, and we're going to make it flush with this face. And let's see how we get on with that. Having successfully navigated part one, we reach onto the floor and get this is just a piece of bar that my dad's liberated from a steelworks where he used to work. It's 20 mil, so 2 centimetre bar. And what I'm going to do is just start getting some shape into this by just rolling the bar around the rod, keeping it as straight as square to the bar as I possibly can. So I'll do that, and you can see that this material is so thin that I can kind of manipulate it quite easily around the bar. And we'll then offer that up to the former, and we're not far off there. You can see I've scribed a line, a centre line, and I'm going to try and aim to get the wrapper in the centre of this line that's scribed up there. So it needs a little bit more on this side. So we'll just gently go around like so. So we've got something that's going to go around that quite nicely already. And now we need to form this part here, the wasted bit. Now, I've got just off shot here a box full of drills that go up in 0.5 millimeters. And I think experience tells me that the 10 mil drill might do it, because the nickel silver is so springy. So what we'll do is we'll line the centre line with this centre line, and we'll put the drill there approximately where we want the curve to be, and we'll hold that there, and we'll start putting a bit of shape into the bottom of the former there with the drill. And we'll just offer that up. You see, that's not bad already. That's pretty good, except for the fact that it's in entirely the wrong place. So we need to move that curve. So what we're going to do is we're going to bend the end of the, nearer to the end of the sheet around the drill shank, and then we're going to relieve that bit there. And you can see it's quite easy to manipulate material that's this thin. And the idea is that you put quite small curves into it. Keep offering it up. You can see we need to put a bit more curve in there to get that bit into there, into that radius. So we'll go back to the big bar, and we'll just, can you see that? You can, can't you? We'll just ease that round the bar there. Well,
is that nickel silver sheet you've used then?
Nickel silver, yeah, 10-pound nickel silver. Now you can see that we're getting quite close there. That's not a bad fit, but this won't fit at all because the curve's still in the wrong place. So we need to go in here and, sorry, using the drill, and just try and move that curve a little bit further along the bar. So,
Have any problem with it work hardening as you keep moving it?
No, because I'm not really working it very much. So we've rolled it a bit further close to the end of the bar, and we're relieving it, and we're going to kind of work it around there like that as well. And actually look, we're quite close there, and the line there is quite close to the top. The centre line there does match reasonably well. In fact, if anything, I think I've probably taken it a bit too far. So maybe we'll go back a little bit.
Is there no rivet detail on this one then?
There's no rivet detail on this one, but it's not a problem if there is rivet detail. You would obviously emboss the rivet detail first, because you're not putting this through slip rollers. You're not going to crush all the rivets. So I'm kind of quite happy with that. So we'll move to this side and start forming this side. And we know now how close to the edge of the wrapper we've got to start doing this. So we'll grab hold of that and start putting a little bit of shape into it with the around the 10mm drill. Do that. You can see I'm an utter mile out there. So we'll relieve that there around the bar. Oh, and we're getting quite close there. I thought that was in the centre, and it's nowhere near the centre at all, is it? So again, we're just checking all the time. We're going to have to move this curve a little bit further back along the path.
If you've done all this work and realised you've cut it a millimetre too short.
No, it's exactly the right length. Because I have double checked, don't worry about that. So,
How many smoke boxes have you built so far to get to this level of scale?
I probably build a smoke box every 3 or 4 weeks. And sometimes I do them in pairs. So it's like everything else, isn't it, really? It's just experience. Right, now I'm happy with that. That bit's pretty good. There's a bit of a sticky up bit there. Let's deal with that. That's because it's been rolled a little bit too much there. So that's good. It's good to there.
Yeah, James points out that nickel silver does work harden, but not enough to worry about.
Yeah, this isn't work hardening at all. With this little bit of folding. So I think that's pretty good all the way around. So maybe we're at the stage where we'll start tacking it. I think we need to just move this curve a fraction round the sheet. So we'll roll it a bit more there. Take a bit out of it there. Roll it a tiny bit more. And all the time what I'm trying to do is keep the end of the wrapper parallel with the shank of the bar that you're rolling it around. We'll keep checking as well to make sure that you're rolling something that's nice and square. And
How long have you been scratch building these things then?
well, often it's not. Often it's making a replacement for something that's in a kit. Quite often these days, if I'm building a kit for somebody, I'll find myself just scratch building boilers and smoke boxes, because I sometimes think that they just look better if you don't use the wacky designs that are sometimes in kits. Right, do you know what? I'm so happy with this that I'm going to start soldering it. So
Just
this
a
is
question, what's holding your vertical 20mm rod up at the moment?
what? Sorry,
What was holding your rod up?
it's sat on my lap. It's pushed,
Technicality there.
pushed against. It's actually pushed against my groin.
Too much information.
Right. So I think we'll risk a couple of tacks here. So we'll put. See what I've done there is just made sure that the end of the wrapper is flush with the former using my fingernail, and we're just going to put a little tack just there, thump like that. Okay. Now then, let's just pull that around like so. And we check. What we're going to do here is we're going to check the back, you see, because if the front's right and the front and the back are parallel and in line, then the back will match, and you see that matches pretty well. So I'm happy with that. So we'll put a tack there in the back as well. Of course, I'm calling it the back and front. It's all pretty arbitrary, isn't it, really? There we go, little tack there. Reach back to the front or the back. And put a bit of flux here. About time I've got a new cocktail stick. Just make sure that the end of this is flush with the former, and we'll put a tack there. And then we'll put one here. Like so. And we'll move down to here. We'll put one on there. The thing about these tacks is if anything's not to your satisfaction, you can quite easily break the tack. Now there's a little bit here, look, but it's not quite right, so I think it just needs a little bit of a tweak around me drill like that, and that's a lot better. You see, that's landing quite nicely now in that curve. Or it will be when it's had another quick twist. There we go. A little bit at a time, a little tiny bit at a time. We'll put a piece in there. Nice little tack. I think it's important not to try and force the material around the formers, because then you'll end up distorting them. They won't be square anymore. Then your boiler will disappear off down the footplate at a weird angle, and then you'll have sleepless nights, realising that the following day you're going to have to get up and undo all of your soldering. See, I've just flipped it over, and you can see that it fits pretty well around this side, which means that the front and the back were parallel to each other and at a right angle at the sides, which I'm quite happy with. So we'll tack all this up on the back as well. There we go. So that's kind of the basic thing all tacked together. So I'm kind of quite happy with that. So what we're going to do now is solder the thing up, file it up, and we can get rid of the steel bar now. And the drill. Those. And then we're gonna go around. Just solder it all up. Just basically joining the tacks together. A little bit down there. Did I manage to keep you in shot all the way through this process?
Yeah.
There we go. Solder, solder, solder.
Somebody's mentioned that it looks like you're going to end up with an entirely sealed box.
I am.
You wash out the corrosive flux.
Well, what I would be doing at the next stage would be cutting a hole in it somewhere, wouldn't I? Often there's a screw at the bottom, isn't there, for holding the bolt that goes through, that holds the chassis through the footplate into there. Or often you cut a big hole in the front for the smokebox door anyway.
All right. Nigel Payne's mentioned the fact that you've done a time-lapse video of building a smokebox and boiler.
Yeah, I have, yeah.
And that he's used your construction method.
I know, I saw it on Facebook. I was very impressed. He did really well, and I was also quite flattered. Thank you, Nigel. See, we're not going mad with the solder, because we've got it. The more you put on, the more you've got to razz off later.
Is that a technical term, Raz?
It is.
It's Yorkshire terminology. Somebody else has put on it's Yorkshire.
Is it?
Raz.
Raz is a bit like being Nesh.
Yeah.
Right, so that's kind of soldered. And what we'll do then is we'll get our razzing machine and we'll just take off all the excess material and all the excess solder. Now, it's quite easy on this side because really all we're taking off is the excess solder, because we've got the wrapper, the end of the wrapper more or less flush to the front or the back former. Can't remember now whether this was the front or the back. I've flipped it over so many times.
What do you use to get rid of the flux?
What, sorry?
What would you use to get rid of the flux?
Well, I'm going to go downstairs after this is over, and while I'm pouring a beer, I'll throw it in a bowl of bicarbonate of soda, because bicarbonate, the sort of thing that you use for baking cakes, sodium hydrogen carbonate, and it's a mild base which will neutralise phosphoric acid, which is a mild acid. So then you will end up with no acid left hanging around to corrode anything. And you can see all I'm doing with my little machine here is just taking all the
It's looking very good.
obviously you have to try and make sure that you keep everything nice and square here.
Where did you get the rubber backer from your razzing disc machine?
I'm sorry, where what?
Where did you get the rubber back?
Oh, yes. Well, mine, you see, again, mine's a really cheap brand of mini drill. And if you go on Mini Drill's website, I have to say, that's very unfair for me to say cheap. It was very reasonably priced for those that, you know, like to watch the odd penny or so. But I have to say that this mini drill is about 20 years old, and it just keeps going and going and going. The motor's fine, the transformer has been replaced, and given that I use it as a milling machine and a lathe as well, the bearings are still pretty good, you know, they don't chatter or anything like that. So well done to Mini Drill. Cheap it might have been, a Dremel it certainly isn't, but it has proved quite a reliable workhorse for the last 20 years. Anyway, there we go. That's all the basic razzing done. There's a little bit more there, look at this. And there's a couple of holes I can see now that just need filling. There's one there and one there. So we'll just...
Yeah, I think it was the rubber disc.
Yeah, they're on Mini Drill's Minicraft's website. And they're very reasonable. They're only about £4 or something like that each. And I've got a stash of them because they're one of those kind of essentials. If it splits, and they do eventually, and you don't have a replacement, then you're a bit knackered. You know, you're having to file everything by hand, which considerably lengthens the job. Let's just another go at that. Soldering that up again. There we go. So we'll go back, just tidy all that up there and there, and there's another one there that I missed, a little tiny gap just there. Let's pick that up as well, like that. Right, and then, see, I've treated myself to a new piece of wet and dry. So we're going to just tidy it up like this. When you're editing a time-lapse video, these are the bits that you just edit out there. Because this is the bit really that takes all the time, isn't it? The kind of finishing. I've got some here that's slightly less aggressive. Tighten it up a bit more.
I've forgotten what grip did you say that you use?
This is 180, look. Mm-hmm. And this is also 180 that's been used. And then I've got some here that I think 600 here, which is, you know, the kind of thing I use for finishing it. Get all the scratches out because Warren Haywood's paint jobs usually show up all the scratches straight away. And then we sort of go around the edges, just getting all the solder and all of the burrs off the edge. And that'll be the job done. Well, it won't actually. If you look, there's some little bits at the bottom here, some straight bits. And what we're going to do is, I have here a wrapper that I knackered. I actually cut it too short for a previous job. And what we'll do is we'll just solder that in there, and then we'll cut it off, and then we'll just make that good. So we've got a nice return down to the foot plate, and then we've closed the structure completely then. We'll come to that in a second. That's only a minute or two's job. So we've got a nice smoke box there that's all nice and square. And so that when you look at it from the top, you can see that this isn't a parallelogram. And that's good. And there's a little bit of solder there that came over the edge, so we'll just get rid of that. And because we only put very small rolls, because we formed the wrapper really kind of slowly, a little bit at a time, we didn't put any jinks in it. There's no creases. So that's all really nice, and I'm quite happy with that. Right, let's do this bit then. So if we put that in there, like so. This was a wrapper that I made, and I made that dimension too small, which I can tell you was very irritating. But nevertheless, you just shove that in there like that. Check for squareness. Tap that in place. And we'll solder it to the bottom there. And we'll get a piece of me wood, and we'll go on there with piercing so.
What is that you're using to cut into?
This is it's just a block of wood that I've used a million times for. It's getting quite perforated. Actually, you can see through it. Yeah. Anyway, it's just a piece of wood. It's just something just to rest the workpiece on while I just cut through this bit of scrap. Again, the piece that I'm using, the piece of scrap is 10th. Do it very, very, very gently. Don't go at it, and you don't break the blade, and you won't bend anything or snap the soldered joint that I've made.
Someone's suggesting that you might have made the wrapper a bit short.
No, well, you'll never get that. You see, you'll never be able to form that curve and then bend it there to go back down to return down to the foot plate. So what I've done is I've just slotted a piece in there from that. What I'm going to do now is just razz that so that's flat with the bottom, the base, and then razz it here so it's flush with the front and the back. And then the difficult bit where I take this piece off to match the return. So this you just do, or I just do, in a series of very light passes with my sanding disc. And don't dwell because the heat will start untacking it, unsoldering it if you're not careful. Sit there and we're done.
What we're saying is there's a return at the bottom of it from the flare outwards. Is that correct?
Say that again, sorry, Tony.
Yeah, is it right? There's a vertical return.
There's a vertical return down to the foot plate that we've just made now using soldering a bit of scrap in. And you can see we've got that nice and parallel and nice and vertical there. So we just need a quick rub there and along the bottom there to make that good. There's a bit just there where there's a hole, but let's just quickly go.
Ian McCormack has come up with the rubber backing pad is item number MB, Mike Bravo, 1780 at Hobbies, if anyone is interested.
Everyone should have one there. If I was going to recommend a tool that everybody should have tonight from all this, it wouldn't be an expensive soldering iron. It would be one of those, because it just saves you so much time. Right, we'll put the other. Should we put the other return in just for completeness? And then we've got a completely closed box then, haven't we? Okay. Cutty. weird, this building, without the arches on. I usually have Radio 4 on the building. Always look forward to the arches in the afternoon.
Instead, you've got me.
Sorry?
Instead, you've got me to talk to you.
No, you're doing really well, Tony.
James is saying, will you be showing us how to mark and drill holes?
I will not. But it's very easy, really. There we go. So that's bye-bye to that until next time. You know what, I was quite blobby with my soldering there. Just very remiss of maybe a little bit of extra work to do now.
I have to say it's better than my soldering.
There we go.
By a long way.
So just that edge now to form and we're done. Again, a series of gentle passes until you blend all that in nicely and get a nice return, vertical return down to the foot flare.
Well, I've just gone onto the Hobbies website and found that the Proxon do a sanding disc arbor for £3.35 with some sanding discs.
Well, that's pretty reasonable as well, isn't it?
Yep.
The sanding discs are quite expensive though. It's I did find it because you get through them quite quickly. You can see this one's knackered now. It's really not taking off much material at all. And the problem when they get like that is that they put more heat into the job.
Yeah.
And you end up unsoldering things.
I notice you use a cocktail stick for applying the flux.
I do.
Have you tried using a small child's paintbrush or anything like that?
I have, but the flux, the acid in the flux does for them eventually, doesn't it? So.
Well, yes.
And also, a cocktail stick does that thing where it doesn't really put much flux on at once, so you have less of a problem with corrosion. And you can see that's not quite parallel, so we'll just take a bit off there, so it is. And I think, ladies and gents, that is, as they say, that, and I claim victory. So there we go.
Dougie Hayes mentioned he buys large self-adhesive sanding discs and punches out.
All right, yeah. I just draw around a pound coin and cut them out. There we go. So that's that.
That looks good.
That's all nice and square. That return there's the same height as that. So that'll fit nice and snugly between the frames.
Mm-hmm.
So that's ready to go in the box and be sent out to a hopefully satisfied customer. once I've filled this tiny pinhole just there. There we go.
Do you have time to show us how to do the marking out of the drill holes?
What, sorry?
Will you have time to show us the marking out of the drill holes?
Yeah, I can do that. You want me to drill this?
Does it need drilling? Of course it does for the chimney, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Okay, we could do that. We can make a pilot hole for the chimney. So let's just re-establish the vertical there because we've razzed it off with the sanding disc.
See, you use a scalpel blade as a scriber as well.
Ooh. Is that bad practice?
Does it work? Yes.
It does. So we'll go make a light line along there. Now I'm assuming, of course, that the chimney's in the middle. Kind of is, isn't it?
Yep.
So we'll take that measurement, which is 15, 16, 17.2. .6. I don't know whether this is good workshop practice or not. So that's set at 8.6 and that's marked at the centre of that. So this is hard because the material's quite thin. So if you press on too much with your scriber, you're going to make a big indentation. So I'm just gently making a hole there. And I have here some drills, and we'll start with a 0.5 millimetre one because it's a tiny, tiny, tiny little indentation in the top of the smoke box. We've done with that now. There we go.
What size drill is that?
4.5 millimetres. Just put a little bit of spit on the end of the drill. It's not very sharp, is it? There you go. And there's a pilot hole. Do you want to make it bigger?
Yep, go for it.
Should we jump to 1 millimetre? There we go. So that's got a pilot hole there for the chimney. We'll just take that scribed line off, and the same there. We'll leave a little bit on at the top because I think that the actually it hasn't. Look, I thought the loco might have had a handrail knob just there at the top, but it hasn't. But I think it's quite nice to have a very lightly scarred line there, so you can line up the chimney when you put that on with it. And that is that.
Well, that's very good, is that?
So if anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask, fire away.
There's just a suggestion from Jan that uses waterproof felt pen tip to paint the area around where you wanted to scribe a line. Then you can do a lighter scribed line, you can see it easier.
That's not a bad idea, is it? Yeah, thank you for that. I do have a selection of felt tip pens here that at some point belonged to my wife, and my son, but they're all they're here. Look, I never thought about that actually. Just colouring it in a bit and scribing through the. That's a good idea. I shall use that in future. Thank you very much. That's a good suggestion.
I mentioned about this Proxon sanding disc with Arbor from Hobbies. It's hobbies.co.uk as opposed to Hobby Holidays.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, and it's Hobbies spelled Hobbies.
They fail just here eventually. The shank and the rubber arbor there, they sort of part company. So what you'll find is when you try to sand something, this stops and this carries on turning. I think I've got one here that's self-destructed a few days ago. Look.
Oh yes.
But they're certainly, if I was going to recommend, I wouldn't spend a huge amount of money on a soldering iron, but I would spend £4 on that. That's one of the best tools I've got, and it's really good for doing etching cusps as well, going along the ends of sheets that have been etched.
Yes.
Just getting that etching cusp off it gets it off very, very, very quickly. It saves hours of soldering. I mean, obviously it won't go into all the corners. You're still going to have to sort of do a bit of hand filing, but that's certainly worth £3 of anybody's money, isn't it? That.
When you're actually constructing a scratch built model, do you have a particular order that you do things?
Well, I always like to start with the smokebox actually and work my way forward, and try and make sure that everything kind of lines up with the centre of the getting this is quite essential in a way, actually getting the right diameter here, because a lot of boilers, especially really old ones like this, were bolted. The boilers were bolted to the smokebox with a series of bolts that go all the way around the perimeter.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the drawings, you can quite often see the end of the flange there, and then often they've got a polished brass cover plate that goes over the tops of the bolt heads to hide them. And you need to kind of start doing some quite careful measurements when you get there, because you need the diameter of the boiler plus the thickness of the brass finishing piece that goes round there, and then another kind of flange. And what you end up doing then is cutting out a circle and soldering that onto the back of the smoke box to represent the flange. And then the boiler goes onto solders onto the back of this, and obviously you try to use the hole there that you used for your compass as a kind of a guide. I usually just solder a little tiny piece of rod into that and have a similar hole in the end of the former on the boiler that at least gets you in the ballpark area. But the problem with doing this is it's not an exact science. It's really difficult to get this perfectly circular, and it's also really difficult to roll a boiler that's perfectly circular as well. It's a bit of an art to get slip rollers to finish the end of the sheet before it flips out of your slip rollers. Really, you have to put the sheet, turn the slip rollers round and roll the end of the sheet, pre-roll it by putting it the wrong way through the rollers. And then that way you can get something that's nearly circular in cross section. But there's always a bit of jiggling, to try and achieve the best fit, which sometimes you can hide with your brass polished finishing strip as well. I always make the finishing strips out of square brass that you bend into a circle in your slip rollers, and then radius one edge, go all the way around and radius the edge with your trusty disc, and then polish it once it's all been soldered in place. And that's quite nice to finish. And then of course the smoke boxes, sometimes they're flat top sort of Velpair type ones, and sometimes they're round top ones. And actually the round top ones are more difficult to make, because the radius of the top of the boiler has to match the radius of the smoke box. And I don't like making the boiler and the smoke box out of one sheet, because I mean, it works okay if it's a tank engine, because you can't see the return on the firebox, can you? It's hidden behind the tanks. But if you roll a boiler into a cylinder and then make some cuts and then try to relieve the curved bottom of the boiler outwards to form the sides of the smoke box, it's really difficult to get it to be nice and smooth without it getting any jinks in it where it's been folded the wrong way and you're trying to straighten it up. It's really not as difficult, not as easy as you think. And a lot of kits make that mistake, don't they, where you'll see that there's been an etch on one of the frets that they've cut off in, I say factory, but it's probably somebody's shed somewhere, isn't it? And then they bung all that through some slip rollers and roll it approximately into a cylinder. And then you've got to kind of somehow try and manipulate the bottoms of the boiler out to form the sides of the firebox, and that's really difficult to do, because often they're rolled out of 0.45 or 18th thou or 15th thou or wherever it is, and it's quite difficult to, you know, actually get it to straighten up and it to be smooth, you know, and not have any jinks in it and things like that. That's quite hard. So yeah, I always try to work my way forward from the cab. But you need to do your measurements in advance, you know, if you want to scratch build one. And it's kind of quite a lot of head scratching to make sure that. And I can't say that if you look down there in the scrap bin, you won't see loads of, you know, boilers that have been tossed in there because they didn't quite come out as I hoped that they would, or they were the wrong diameter. That's quite annoying.
I mentioned a bit earlier about using markers. It's been mentioned that they use Wilco permanent markers, the spirit-based ones.
All right. Then you can wash it off afterwards with some acetone or some meths or something.
Are you just tidying up now?
Yeah, I'm just polishing it now while you're firing questions at me.
Yeah. There's so many questions coming through, so if anybody's got any questions,
feel free to ask.
Please do post them. Ian Majors mentioned that he doesn't recommend using a photocopier for resizing diagrams because you can't guarantee that the X and the Y magnification being the same. Yeah,
it's very difficult, isn't it? I went to the Railway Museum on Thursday. Should have gone on Friday, actually. My booking was on Friday, but they did let me in. And I kind of just took loads and loads of photographs with my phone camera. I used to, in the olden days, have a DSLR camera that I took to the Railway Museum taking photographs. But they're absolutely dreadful for distorting at the edge, aren't they?
Yes.
And I kind of put the pictures on a private WhatsApp group to share with a guy who's 3D printed me some parts for a loco I'm currently making someone. And he had some really trick software that squared everything up.
Yeah.
You know, took the distortions out right to the edge. I was quite taken with that.
Can you just remind us what thickness nickel silver you were using there?
Yeah, it's 10 thou, so it's about 0.3. Let's just check. Here's some. I think it's 10 thou, isn't it? Yeah, 0.3, look.
Yeah.
That is 10 thou for those people that still work in furlongs and chains.
There was a question earlier on as to why nickel silver, why not brass? Do you have a preference?
I'm going to say that the only reason that I use nickel silver is because it looks shinier and nicer. Is that a ridiculous reason to use it? It's quite springy. I mean, it tends not to distort quite as much with the heat from your soldering iron as brass. But on the other hand, it's a bit more springy, so it's a bit more difficult to, you know, manipulate. You need, if you're using something like slip rollers, sometimes you can't get quite the same amount of curvature in with nickel silver, because it wants to spring back. It's not quite as malleable. Is that the right word, or is it ductile as brass?
What thickness nickel silver would you use for a chassis or cab sides?
Well, I would go to 0.8. What's that in? It's not really 0.8, is it? It's nearly 0.8. But what's that in thousandths? Is that
About 28,000.
Is that 20,000?
No, it's bigger than that. It's one millimeter is 40 thou.
Oh, right.
It's about 32.
Right. Okay. I mean, that's kind of the bog standard, isn't it? That kit manufacturers use. But often if I'm making building a chassis, you make it out of 2 laminations, and so that you can, it is a bit of a pain in the bum, because you end up having to cut out 4 parts to make a chassis. But what you can do is you can emboss the rivets on both sides that way. So when you stick it together, and if you do that out of 0.45, or probably I wouldn't do that. I'll probably make 1 out of 0.45 and 1 out of 0.3, so you've got something that's about 0.8. Is about 0.8 prototypical? I'm not entirely sure, to be honest with you. What were the real things made out of? Was it about 3/4 steel plate or something like that? Would you say?
A question's been asked about
Bigger than that.
what do you use to clean up when you haven't got a nice big surface area, say underneath pipework in your models?
What do I use to clean up?
Yes.
Well, I use a series of scrapers. Scalpels are very good for, just getting bits of solder out that have disappeared underneath something and you're struggling to get to it. But you have to be very careful with a scraper that you don't scrape the solder off and start damaging the surface of the metal, because then that upsets the painter, because you can see the scrape marks. I mean, there's no magic bullet to cleaning up, really. You just have to it's just patience and abrasives, isn't it, really? As you can see me doing here, I'm kind of checking the edge of the base there and just making sure that everything's nice and flat, so it sits quite nicely on there. So when it sits quite nicely on his foot plate, it's nice and square, you see. Quite happy with that. It's worked out quite well, that, hasn't it, for a Blue Peter thing? That didn't even have one on my knee that I'd done earlier that I
How are you going to fix that?
Well, you weren't watching.
How are you going to fix that to the foot plate?
Well, I'm not. Somebody else is going to fix that to their foot plate, aren't they? But I wouldn't. I would build the boiler and the firebox onto it, and then offer it up to the loco, and it'd find its own position on the foot plate, and then I would probably just tack solder it, and then tack solder the firebox to the spectacle plate to the front of the cab, and then make it all good. And often, actually, you have to be a bit smart, don't you, and solder a screw, a nut or something on the inside of this, so you can screw up from your chassis. Or probably what I would do is just make a massive hole there and have the nut on the foot plate.
Mm-hmm.
Cut a big hole in it there. And usually, if I'm cutting a hole, I would use a slitting disc. If you can't see it, just go and then pull the square out.
As in your video.
Is that how I do it in my video?
Yes.
Do I do the sound as well by going?
No, there's just pretty music being played in the background.
It depends on your view of Latin jazz, that, doesn't it? Any other questions, guys?
Well, we've still got a lot of people in the room watching. Everybody's fascinated by what you're doing. And
we're not really doing anything now. We're just kind of, hey, look, that's not too bad, that, is it? Look, it just sits quite nicely. That. On the drying area, I'll take that. It's not too bad at all. Actually, That's rubbish, isn't it? Because this is slightly bigger than that. Because it is, look.
And so it should be.
Yeah.
1.05.
5.05, yeah. Does anybody, I suppose the problem with photocopying and reprinting these is that don't printers distort things at the edges as well? Is that right? Anybody who's
Well, different printers got different qualities, and some of them are better than others.
right. Well, mine's a really cheap one, so it's going to be rubbish, isn't it?
Somebody on here suggests that HP printers may be reasonable quality.
All right, mine is a HP one. But you can tell, look, that dimension there on the drawing, there, it's marked at 4 feet, which is 28, isn't it? And you can see, look, it scales out at just over 26. So, hence the 1.05. I suppose what you really need to do is to pick the biggest dimension that you can find, isn't it? 8'3", that's 8 1/4, isn't it? 8 1/4 feet. So that's 8.25 times 7. 8.25 times 7 is 57.75. And that's miles out, you see, that's only about 54.6. So
Yeah.
it's about the same, isn't it? It's about the same amount of distortion. But we can work it out, can't we?
Nigel Payne's mentioning you have to check both the verticals and the horizontal.
Yeah, that's what I was doing, because if you look, that's a vertical one, and this one, although this one's quite close to the edge. I don't know. I really don't know.
As long as it all fits together at the end of the day.
Well, I think so, yeah. Should be 61.25, and it's actually, is that right? 8.25 times 7 is 57.75. So if you divide that by what it actually is, which is roughly 54.4.
Someone's asking about rivet
That
details.
scales at 1.06. I did it at 1.05, so it's not a million miles out, is it? Somebody's asking about what, sorry?
Rivet details. Should he use a tool with a punch and die?
Yeah, I've got a couple actually. I've got this one that I use most often, and this is a. I think,
yes.
Isn't this a metalsmith's one?
It is. I recognise it. I've just bought one.
Yeah, and it's kind of. I think it's screwed to a bit of. MDF. Might be better if I show you on the face cam. Although it's getting a bit dark now, and you might not be able to see anything if I turn this light on. No, it's not too bad, is it? Yeah, that's a metalsmith's thing, and I mounted it on some MDF, and I just put some pieces of wood there to support the sheet across the anvil, and these have been cut by a router so that they're the same height that the anvil is above there. And then I've got another one and this is good because you get a kind of a handle, don't you, for forming the rivets.
And you've also got a guide as well, haven't you?
Yeah, that's got a guide on it, and that's quite good. And then I've got this one that I bought originally, which I think it came from somebody called Silbert Clocks. Is that right? Does anybody recognise that? And you just hit it there with something, and that forms a rivet. And I kind of didn't really like that because it doesn't really. I mean, it's got a kind of a crude guide here that you can move in and out for, kind of getting your rivets in line. And then it's got. I don't know whether you can see that. I'll probably have to go back to the top cam, won't I? Oh no, it disappeared. Oh no.
We've lost you, Nick.
Yeah, what's gone wrong?
I don't know.
No, me neither. Hold on a second. Just bear with, there's something gone wrong, horribly wrong with my tech. Let me minimize that and relaunch my Droid cam.
That's still running.
We might have to sing amongst ourselves while we wait for Nick to come back.
You might.
Apparently, there's a program called Inkscape, and it can be used to sort out all the problems. No need for calculations and rulers. Is that a CAD program, Inkscape? Somebody called Ian Majors mentioned it.
I'm back.
It's a vector graph.
There's Rob. Come on.
It's Rob Pullen, but he's muted. And now we've lost him.
Hello, it's Ian.
We're back on thingy cam, aren't we? There we go.
There we are.
Go on. Anybody got any questions while I'm just sorting out my tech?
Yeah. I think I'm
See you again now, Nick.
the what, sorry?
We can see you again now. Oh, now I've lost your image again. There we go. Nick, you're muted.
No, he's not.
He's got no volume.
He's got no volume, but he's not muted.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can hear you now.
That's it.
Hooray! There we go. The tech works. Yeah, sorry, Silbert clocks. I think this one, but I kind of don't use that anymore. It's a bit too crude. And I did think about getting one of those. I think that Lee Marsh sells really fancy ones, doesn't he, that are marketed under the Marsh Reynolds thingy range. And they've got like an XY table on them, so you can really space your rivets accurately. And that's probably a good idea for something like a smokebox wrapper, isn't it? I mean, you could pre-emboss it. I wonder what happened there with the tech. It all seems to be working okay now. I mean, obviously, you would just form your rivets around there. And it wouldn't have made that much difference to this process, really, would it? Because we put the wrapper on flush with this face. So you would know that dimension to your row of rivets. Then you would know that dimension to your second row of rivets. And then when you took the waste off around the edge, with a bit of luck, the rivets would all be in the right place. So yeah, I just use a Metalsmiths one is the answer to your question, which is just here. And this isn't kind of a advert for Dave Smith, but I've also got one of his rolling bar things here as well, which I was lucky enough to find on eBay, which is quite good, isn't it? It had a big ding in it there I had to grind out, but otherwise that works quite well.
When you're doing bolts, is there any better way to represent bolts than soldering in?
Well, I always buy proprietary, fake nuts and bolts. I don't know whether we're going to be able to see them on the... There's a couple of places that make them that I've found. There's a place called Scale Hardware in Florida. They're quite good. And there's a place in Germany. My German's not very good. Levelbauversand. And they make tiny. Can you see those on the... It won't really focus on.
Goodness me.
And they're really tiny. These are sort of 0.5 of a millimetre. I've got some that are 0.6. And you just have to really drill tiny holes and let them in one by one. But they're a bit bigger. Can you see those? They're kind of like fake nuts and bolts. I don't think I can get the camera to focus on them.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to focus on them, Nick.
No, it's just a bit too close.
They are.
But that's how I do nuts and bolts. I just kind of buy them and drill holes and let them in one by one. That sounds like a terribly sort of tedious job, and it is. And also the nuts and bolts are actually quite expensive as well.
There's two further questions coming in. What horn blocks are you using on the Z class?
What, sorry?
What horn blocks?
Well, moving on to the Z class, hang on, it is over here. Here's one I made earlier. That's the chassis for the Z class. And as you can see, I used 1.5 times 1.5 millimeter L section as the horn cheeks. And I just used Slater's axle boxes, and they fit quite nicely in there, like so. Except that doesn't fit quite nicely in there because it's not the right one. That's number 1 right, which is this one. So that should fit quite nicely in there. It does look. So that's kind of a Slater's axle box. I mean, it really shouldn't work on the work quite like that. They should be all in board supported like so. But this is kind of a cheaper and quicker way of doing it. And then a friend of mine.
Can you buy the horn blocks separately?
You can, well, I mean, you can get sort of generic horn blocks off people like Slater's and Laurie Griffin and various other people. But I always put these 1.5 by 1.5 millimeter, use the horn cheek, make the horn cheeks out of 1.5 times 1.5 millimeter angle. And then my friend with the 3D printer, who squared up the drawing of the Z class that I got from the Railway Museum the other day, is going to print me the bolt plates. So we'll have a 3D printed structure that just slots over the horn cheeks here to represent the bolt plates. And they'll just be 3D printed because they're not structural, they're just, you know, cosmetic. And I'll just slot them in place and just glue them on. But the structural bits all soldered brass. And then they've got kind of the Z class has got a really fancy, I don't know whether you can see on the Z class. They're just there, look, let's see if we can. They've got a really, you can't see that either, can you? They've got a really weird keeper plate at the bottom of the horn guide, which he's going to 3D print for me as well. So, I mean, that's really upsetting the camera, isn't it, that GA look? Because it's like lots of GAs. There's lots and lots of layers, aren't there? Sort of drawn on the top of each other. But yes, I use Slater's. The short answer to the question is Slater's axle boxes.
And can you get the Slater's?
He sells them separately. He sells them separately. If you ring them up, there's a catalogue number that starts with an X. But if you just tell them brass axle boxes, square axle boxes, I can't remember, they're about 50p each or something. I just buy a bag of them every so often when I've run out. But I always use theirs. The Finney 7 ones are quite good, but they're a lot wider. I mean, you get if you've got a garden layout maybe, and your priority there is having a big bearing, some big bearing surface area, and you might be better off going for the Finney 7 ones. Of course, other brands are available, but they start to protrude too far on this side of the chassis, and then you can't get any inside motion in there between the axle boxes without, kind of doing surgery on the horn cheeks. I kind of try to avoid that. I don't know what people think. Do you think that there's enough bearing surface area in there? I don't know.
Sure it'll work.
The wheels don't turn very quickly, do they? So they're not going to wear out very quickly, I would have thought. I had this discussion at length with my dad. My dad's a proper engineer, not like me. And he and Nick Baines as well at Telford one year. And we were discussing the merits or otherwise of roller bearings in toy train axle boxes. There was a fashion, wasn't it, a few years ago for using roller bearing. Your roller bearings in here, and both Nick and my dad said that, being proper engineers, that you couldn't use roller bearings in that application because they weren't supported properly. The inner and the outer races have to be held in concentricity. Is that the right word? They have to be held concentric with each other. Yeah. You can imagine them in a push bike hub. you know, the outer races are supported in a tube that goes across the centre of the wheel, and the inner races are held on the axle, also concentric with each other and concentric with the outer races as well. And that's really the application that rolling element bearings should be used in. And if you use them like this, it's actually using the bearing as a lever as the axle goes up and down. And if you look at a real railway application, when they do put roller bearings in axle boxes, the bearings are connected by what's called I think they call it a barrel axle box, don't they? Where the bearings here, the bearing housings are joined together with a big tube that the axle goes down the middle of. If you look at a lot of British Railways, standard engines were built like that, you know, with roller bearings, so that they were, you know, a lot more resistant to wear and didn't need so much frequency of maintenance. But they were all held in cannon axle boxes. Somebody will pick me up on this. I think the LNER did it, didn't they? Once Gresley, it wasn't the CME anymore. Wasn't it one of Thompson's things, that as well, using cannon axle boxes?
I think you'll find, Nick, that that's because I think they use taper roller bearings, and they cannot take any misalignment of the axle from the outer.
Well, you have to preload. You have to preload tapered ones as well.
Do, yeah.
I have no idea how they preload them.
Well, we are getting towards the end.
I know how you do it on a motorbike wheel or a car wheel, but, but not like this.
A ball bearing in its race will take a certain amount of misalignment.
Will it?
Yeah. But you know,
small angles. Nick Baines might disagree with that, but anyway.
I started off an apprenticeship with a bearing manufacturer, so.
Oh, did you?
I did, yeah.
Oh, right, okay. I mean, the other thing that he was explaining to me was that the inner races have to be an interference fit on the shaft, don't they, i.e. the axle. Otherwise, the bearing jams and the axle just turns in the inner race.
It does, yeah, that's true. We are getting towards 10 o'clock, and I think with quite a few of the people who have joined us today have already left.
Wandered off.
Are we happy to end this session at this point?
If anybody else has got anything that's pressing, otherwise I'd be quite happy to toddle off.
We just need to advertise the next session, don't we?
Yeah, you can do that. I'm going. On behalf of Nick and the Gauge Guild, I'd like to say thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's been a fabulous evening. I've learnt a lot, and I will be tackling my first scratch-built loco quite soon, I hope. So thanks very much to Nick. Nick, do you want to say something?
Well, just to say that scratch building seems quite daunting, but as you've seen tonight, it's if you have a kind of quite a methodical approach to it, and you are quite careful and quite accurate in the way that you cut things out and assemble them, it's actually quite straightforward and quite satisfying.
Yep. And Tony?
Well, all I've got to say is thank you very much, Nick. And don't forget, there's on the 26th of next month, there is an evening with Tim Stubbs and Peacehaven. And the tomorrow, that will go live. You'll be able to subscribe to that, and we'll see you there. Do you have any of the PowerPoint presentations for that, James?
For Peacehaven, no.
No. All right then. Well, take a look on the Guild website. It will be going live, as I say, tomorrow automatically, and you'll be able to reserve your place for next month. Looking forward to seeing Tim Stubbs at Peacehaven. Outdoor layout.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tony. Well,
and thank you everybody. Thank you everybody that's made it to the bitter end. You've got loads of stamina. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Nick. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.